You're in back? Yes. Okay. Then it's fine. Sorry.
Okay. Can all volunteers please come in and close the doors? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'm just going to start with a very brief intro because our Professor Chomsky is very limited. Nothing I can say here today, in the limited time I have, will do our special guest today justice after a lifetime of great achievements. As many of you know, our guest is an Institute Professor and Professor of Linguistics Emeritus at MIT. He has received many honorary degrees and been described as the father of modern linguistics. In addition to writing and lecturing on linguistics, philosophy, and intellectual history, he is well known for his critiques of US foreign policy, one example being criticizing the US support for the occupation of Palestine. He is truly a global and influential political activist, beginning with his stance against the Vietnam War and more recently speaking to the Occupy movement. Today, he will be speaking to us about Palestine and US policy. Ladies and gentlemen, Imperial College Palestinian Society very proudly presents Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, I'd try to leave as much time as possible for discussion, so I'll make a couple of introductory comments and then throw it over to you. I'd like to talk about a few topics briefly. One is the most important question of what are the actual options for Palestinians today. Second question is what are some more longer-term possibilities that might be approached over time. And the third question related to this is what can we learn from the South African legacy? It's a very live issue, as you may know. Last week in the United States, I don't know this year too, was Israel apartheid week. A lot of talks at colleges all over the country. They've had a cousin myself. It's in fact now probably the largest major issue on U.S. campuses. Quite a change from a couple of years ago. And it's in the context of Israeli apartheid. So I'll say a couple of words about that. As far as the options are concerned, the debate and discussion about this issue almost invariably proposes two options. Let's choose one. The one option is two-state settlement, long-standing international consensus. And the other option that's discussed is one state. Israel essentially takes over the whole of the occupied territories, what we now call occupied Palestine. It's last November. And then there'll be a civil rights struggle and an anti-apartheid struggle, and the South African analogy begins to apply. Actually, I think this discussion is mostly beside the point, because it systematically evades a third option, which in fact is the most realistic one. Unless we consider that one, the rest of the discussion is marginal. Now, the third option is that Israel, with U.S. backing and tacit European support, will just continue doing exactly what it's doing now. That's the realistic option. And I think we know what it's doing now. It's not a big secret. You can see it on the ground. Essentially, the first point is to continue to separate Gaza from the West Bank. That's been U.S.-Israeli policy since about 1991, been, of course, explicit violation of the Oslo Accords a couple years later, which declared that they're an invisible territorial unity, but things that states sign don't mean anything. So there's been a long policy of trying to separate them from one another. And that's quite significant. For one thing, it means that the ghetto will simply remain a kind of a prison. But the other significance is that it means any form of autonomy that's ever achieved in the West Bank will have no access to the outside world. The access would have to be through Gaza, seaport, airport, and so on. The only access would be through Jordan, and that's being closed off by a very systematic policy over some years now of taking over the Jordan Valley. Israel takes over the Jordan Valley, and then whatever's left in the West Bank is totally imprisoned, totally. No access anywhere. Back in 1967, the population of the Jordan Valley, which is a fertile valley, was about 300,000 Palestinians. Now it's less than 60,000, plus a lot of Israeli settlers. And that's a slow, steady process. Israel's by now taken over more than 3/4 of the Jordan Valley, 77% or so, and it's increasing. So by the usual methods, to go back to 100 years, the slow takeover devices are now establish a military region in which all settlements, indigenous Palestinian settlements, have to be removed. It stays that way for a while. Jewish settlements come in, or nature reserves, which are sort of like that, and other devices. And it's going on constantly. If you follow it, you can read regular reports in the press of small steps. A couple of weeks ago, the Israeli army dispossessed a small encampment of about 60 people, half of the children, destroyed the huts, the Red Cross tents that had already resettled civilian tents, ensured that no truck is allowed to carry humanitarian goods. If they found bottles of water that were spilled out, and send the people somewhere else. So that's the steady process. And it's continuing, and as I say, that leaves the rest of the West Bank totally imprisoned. The West Bank itself, Israel's following policies that actually go back to 1967 haven't really changed much, to take over probably roughly 40% of occupied Palestine, the West Bank. Anything valuable would affect arable land, aquifers, water reserves, the nice suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. east of Greater Jerusalem through the town of Malda-Dunim, which was constructed mostly in the 1990s with the purpose of breaking up, essentially bisecting the West Bank. Its borders go practically to Jericho, which means that if a Palestinian wants to go on what are called Palestinian roads, if you've ever been there, are kind of small roads right over the body. It's raining, you might fall in and so on. Israelis go on superhighways. If you want to get from, say, Bethlehem to Ramallah, which is probably 20 minutes if you go straight, you have to go way out to the east of Jericho and come around. So that's one that breaks it up. There's another one to the north that goes to the town of Ariel, and we might be misled into thinking that there was a sort of open-minded component to the latest Israeli election, namely Yair Lapid, who's supposed to be the candidate of the middle class, not too nationalist, but he opened his campaign in the town of Ariel, which is telling everybody without having a policy platform that we're going to take over the West Bank. That's another corridor up still further to the north. In fact, what would be left are just semi-isolated cantons. We have some contact if you go way out to the east. There's still one gap in the system that's the corridor that's called E1, which the UN began to reflect third world opinion. Before that, it was just enhanced in the United States, so it didn't have to be anything. But by the mid-60s, it was more, it began to reflect international opinion, so the U.S. and Britain had to take the lead and lead them for everything that comes along. And no one else to do with those. Britain and the U.S. way ahead. The U.S. vetoes a resolution. It's practically a double veto. It doesn't happen, and it's vetoed from history. So if you read scholarship or media or anything, this is not there because the laws say it's not going to happen. There was another, in 1980, the same resolution was brought, the U.S. vetoed it again. Today, the General Assembly, but there's no veto in theory, but there actually is one. There's regular votes, 151 to 30, and so on, with the U.S. voting against, so it's gone. That's true on issue after issue, not just Palestine. It's the way a lot of the world, like it or not, the world is ruled by force, not by law. Pretend otherwise in international relations courses, but that's the way it works. And that goes on right to the present. This rarely gets any notice, but there was one case, a recent case, the most recent U.S. veto actually did get some notice. That was in February 2011, when the U.S. vetoed a Security Council resolution that called for the implementation of official U.S. policy. And that was unusual enough so that there was some press commentary. The resolution called for an end to settlement expansion, which is a minor issue. That's what's talked about all the time, but it's a very minor issue. The issue is settlements, not settlement expansion. But that's official U.S. policy, and the U.S. vetoed it, which they should get some notice. So is there a long-term option for a binational state today? I think there is. If a two-state settlement is established, it's very likely to lead to erosion of borders. Any of you familiar with this area know that there's simply no rational way of drawing a border through the former Palestine. And in fact, every time tensions have reduced in the past, there has been a integration, maybe as close to something like a binational state happens elsewhere. European Union, in fact, is the case. I don't think that's the end of the road, frankly. I don't see any reason to worship the imperial borders. The borders in the whole region, like all through the world, were just imposed by imperial force. They don't mean anything, except, in fact, almost all the conflict in the world, if you look, is related to the borders that the imperial states imposed in a perfectly arbitrary way for their interests, but nothing to do with the people involved. This kind of struck me 60 years ago when my wife and I were students. We were backpacking up to northern Israel, and we walked into Lebanon. And there's no marked border. We're walking around Lebanon, and a Jeep drove by, and somebody yelled out to us, "You're in the wrong country." We came back. But that's correct. The border is perfectly artificial, like most all borders. We built conquest. And I think that it's entirely possible that a further step would be to erode the imperial borders, which, as I said, don't mean anything for the people involved, except to separate them from one another. And that could lead to some form of regional integration, and maybe something analogous to what existed during the Ottoman period, where he wants to bring back the Ottoman Empire, but they had some things sort of right. There weren't any, which is to the east, number one, to the east of Greater Jerusalem. It goes between, it would close off the final access of Jerusalem to the West Bank. Leads from Jerusalem to Ma'ala. And up until now, Israel is very eager to settle it. Until now, every U.S. administration has prevented them from settling that. If the United States gives orders, everybody's got to follow them. That's what it means to be the biggest thug on the block. So they do what they're told they have to. And every U.S. administration so far has told Israel they can't do it. And this is the first administration, Obama, who really hasn't said anything. He's some mild things about how it would be helpful or something like that, but no direct orders not to do it. So chances are they'll take that as an invitation to go ahead, and that may close off Jerusalem totally from the West Bank. So you have the prison in Gaza, you have cantons left in the West Bank, and all in prison because there's no access to the outside. Now that's the very definite plan, nothing secret about it. It's been going on steadily pretty much since 1967. There's a broader plan, which goes way back into Zionist history and has been articulated over and over, especially since 1967, by high officials. And that's just to get the Palestinians out. They don't belong there. They're a foreign implant. They left Israel, promised Jews, so the implant just really ought to leave. That actually goes back to Christian Zionism, which goes back way before Jewish Zionism, and is an underestimated component of the Western support for Zionism. So people like Lord Balfour, for example, was a devout Christian, Bible-reading Christian. It says in the Holy Book that Jews are supposed to go back to Palestine, and everyone else doesn't belong there. Woodrow Wilson was similar. Officials of the Roosevelt administration described the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration That's a big piece of the population. In the past, they were not really part of the political system, just people out in the Midwest and Southwest listening to praise preachers. But that's changed. It's changed primarily because of what's happened to the Republican Party. The Republican Party, about 20 or 30 years, has abandoned any pretense of being a normal parliamentary party. They literally, I mean, they're just in lockstep servility to the very rich and the corporate sector. That's it. They have a capitalism that everybody has to follow and so on. But you can't get votes that way. So they have to try to mobilize some kind of a base. And what they've done is, the only thing possible, turned to sectors of the population that have always been there, but have been marginalized from the political system because they've been regarded as crazy. One sector is the Christian right, which has a whole theology, very pro-Israel, and also extremely anti-Semitic, which is consistent. They think the Jews ought to go back to Israel, then you have a war with the Arab states, everyone gets killed in Armageddon, and the saved souls rise to heaven, and then everybody else goes to eternal perdition, including almost all the Jews. For some reason, 144,000 Jews find Christ at the time they're saved. And you can't get more anti-Semitic than that, but you also can't get more pro-Zionist than that. And so you have to blow up the Temple Mount now, and so on and so forth. And that's now a big piece of American politics. Shouldn't be overlooked. If you follow the Chuck Hagel hearings, the hearings of the Defense Secretary a couple weeks ago, the one rather striking thing, he was berated by the Senate committee for not being sufficiently worshipful of Israel and not wanting to bomb Iran tomorrow, wait a couple of days. But if you look at the attack, it was coming from the Republicans completely, not from the Democrats, which is interesting, because the Democrats are the recipients of almost all of the Jewish money and the Jewish votes. This is, I think, a reflection of the power of the extremist Christian fundamentalist base for the Republican Party and many other illustrations of it. For example, in a different domain, the great hope for the Republican Party in the coming election is Libertarian candidate Rand Paul. Just a couple days ago, introduced legislation which is called the Fetal Personhood Act. A fertilized cell is a person. So that means, of course, no abortion, and so on and so forth. These are the kinds of policies that the fundamentalist Christian right wants to institute, and the party kind of goes along with it. People who run the party are, rich corporate sector types, and they're willing to tolerate this as long as they can use the votes to get power. And that's a significant part of American politics. Well, let's turn to, that's where we're going. Now notice that when this policy is pursued, there won't be any what's called demographic problem. Too many non-Jews in the Jewish state. No anti-apartheid, no civil rights struggle, because no Palestinians. And will be taken over. So that discussion about the second option, one state anti-apartheid struggle, that's just delusion. There's nothing like that in the works. What's in the works are either the international consensus on a two-state settlement, or else the policy that I just described, which is in operation and has been for a long time, has the backing of the United States and other powerful states, whatever words they use. So that's the realistic situation. And what about more longer-term options? Well, there are what's called these days a one-state solution. It used to be called a binational state, more realistically, because there are two national groups, languages, different cultures. So youth activists that opposed the Jewish state, which was consistent at that time, and in favor of binationalist state, Arab-Jewish, working class cooperation using the socialist institutions that had developed. That was a possibility up till 1948. Once 1948 came, that option was closed. Incidentally, if we talk about a one-state settlement or a national state, presumably we're talking about it because we want to achieve it, and not just to talk about it. You need to talk about it. Talk about it. Let's have peace in the world. That's nice. It's our policy. If you really mean it, what you have to do is sketch a path from where we are now to where you'd like to go. At that point, it becomes a serious proposal. Other than that, it's kind of biased thought. And pre-48, there was a path. There wasn't in the following years. But starting in 1967, there again was a path. In 1967, Israel took over the whole of mandatory Palestine, and there was a possibility then of moving towards some kind of maybe federal arrangement or other kind of arrangement which would lead to a binational state of some kind. Actually, there was some support for it within Israeli military intelligence and in sectors of Palestinian society in the country, not abroad. I was writing about it, speaking about it a lot at that time, but there was no resonance that we were interested. And by 1975, roughly, it was over. That option was closed. What had happened was that for the first time, Palestinian national rights reached the international agenda. And at that point, this former idea was out. Well, what was in? What was in at that point was a two-state settlement. The first proposal was in 1976. The proposal came to the Security Council, advanced by the three major Arab states, the confrontation states as they're called, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. They had already made it very clear that they wanted a peace settlement, and Israel and the U.S. wouldn't allow it in the story in itself. But in 1976, they brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for two states on the international border, and then they incorporated the wording of the UN 242, which the UN began to reflect third world opinion. Before that, it was just enhanced in the United States, so it didn't have to lead to anything. But by the mid-60s, it was more, it began to reflect international opinion, so the U.S. and Britain had to take the lead and lead them for everything that comes along. And no one else was even close. Britain and the U.S. way ahead. When the U.S. vetoes a resolution, it's actually a double veto. It doesn't happen, and it's vetoed from history. So if you read scholarship or media or anything, this is not there because the laws say it's not going to happen. There was another, in 1980, the same resolution was brought, the U.S. vetoed it again. The the General Assembly, but there's no veto in theory, but there actually is one. There's regular votes, 51 to 3, with the U.S. voting against, so it's gone. That's true on issue after issue, not just Palestine. It's the way a lot of the world, like it or not, the world is ruled by force, not by law. Pretend otherwise in international relations courses, but that's the way it works. And that goes on right to the present. This rarely gets any notice, but there was one case, a recent case, the most recent U.S. veto actually did get some notice. That was in February 2011, when the U.S. vetoed a Security Council resolution very likely to lead to erosion of borders. Any of you familiar with this area know that there's simply no rational way of drawing a border through the former Palestine. And in fact, every time tensions have reduced in the past, there has been a kind of erosion of the borders just through commercial contacts, cultural contacts, and others. And that could proceed, and I suspect would likely proceed, and it might lead to closer integration, maybe as close as something like a binational state happens elsewhere. European Union, in fact, is the case. I don't think that's the end of the road, frankly. I don't see any reason to worship the imperial borders. The borders in the whole region, like all through the world, were just imposed by imperial force. They don't mean anything, except, in fact, almost all the conflict in the world, if you look, is related to the borders that the imperial states imposed in a perfectly arbitrary way for their interests, but nothing to do with the people involved. This kind of struck me 60 years ago when my wife and I were students. We were backpacking up through northern Israel, and we walked into Lebanon. And there's no marked border. And we're walking around Lebanon, and a Jeep drove by, and somebody yelled out to us, "You're in the wrong country." We came back. But that's correct. The border is perfectly artificial, like most all borders. We built conflicts. And I think it's entirely possible that a further step would be to erode the imperial borders, which, as I said, don't mean anything for the people involved except to separate them from one another. And that could lead to some form of regional integration, and maybe something analogous to what existed during the Ottoman period, where he wants to bring back the Ottoman Empire, but they had some things sort of right. There weren't any, which is the basic diplomatic document that everyone theoretically accepts. The two states there should be guarantees for the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. That's what has become the overwhelming international consensus. It was vetoed by the United States when the United States vetoes a resolution. And incidentally, the U.S. is way in the lead in vetoing resolutions. Britain is second since the mid-60s. That's the point where people were kind of left alone, more or less out of incompetence of the authorities. So the Greeks around their affairs, and Armenians around their affairs, and so on. And that's not an unreasonable framework for complex societies, like most societies. Anyhow, it could move in that direction. That's a longer-term goal. And if it did, I think that's probably the only realistic way in which the Palestinian refugee problem, which is a huge problem, could be seriously addressed. Short of that, I don't see any realistic way of addressing it. Well, those are longer-term proposals. Let's turn to the apartheid analogy. As I said, I think it's partly based on a false premise. The idea that one option is for Israel to take over Palestine and to have an anti-apartheid struggle. No serious chance of that happening. But what can we learn from the apartheid struggle? Well, first of all, where does the term apply? I don't think it's an accurate term to apply to Israel itself. Israel itself has plenty of discrimination, repression, but that's just like most other societies, different forms. The U.S. has it all over the place. But whatever it is, it's not apartheid. It's bad. It's not apartheid. What about the occupied territories, occupied Palestine? Well, there I think the problem is the opposite. What you have there is much worse than apartheid, for a very good reason, which I've already indicated. they had to sustain the black population. And in fact, they were also trying to gain international recognition of the bantu stance. Never managed, except Israel recognized some, but nobody else. But to gain international recognition, they had to make them kind of viable. They tried, but didn't succeed. But none of that's true in the West Bank. Israel doesn't want the Palestinians. It wants them to get out. Same as Gaza, get out. So the apartheid, so what happens there is in fact much worse than apartheid. So I don't think that analogy tells us much. Actually, there is one analogy which isn't discussed, but I think is informative, and that has to do with the history of apartheid. If you look back at it, those of you who think of the apartheid analogy should look at the history and take a look at what actually happened. By the late 1950s, the apartheid regime was recognizing that it's becoming delegitimized, to use a contemporary term, becoming an international pariah. And in 1958, the South African foreign minister called in the American ambassador, and they had an interesting discussion, which happened in the declassified record. He told the American ambassador, look, we're becoming a pariah, everyone votes against us in the United Nations, but it really doesn't matter because you and I both know there's only one vote in the United Nations or in the international arena altogether, and that's yours. So as long as you support us, it doesn't matter if everyone else hates us, which turned out to be pretty accurate. If you look over the following years, there was a big educational program. By the 1970s, there was overwhelming opposition to apartheid. The United Nations declared an arms embargo. By a couple of years later, there was the beginning of programs at a couple of universities to have sanctions, that kind of thing. It's not old media. By the 1980s, the U.S. Congress was passing sanctions against South Africa. Ronald Reagan, who was an extreme racist and also very supportive of South Africa, tried to veto the congressional legislation, but it was passed over his veto. So he then had to evade it to continue support for South Africa, for the South African apartheid. He did. And there was a framework, one that we're all familiar with. The framework was the War on Terror. The War on Terror was not declared by George Bush in 2001. It was redeclared. Reagan has declared it very explicitly 20 years earlier when he came to office. Struggle against international terrorism would be the core of our foreign policy and so on. Well, the African National Congress, Mandela's ANC, was designated, as the official words were, one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. That was 1988, near the end of apartheid. And that, of course, meant that you had to defend white South Africa against international terrorism. Very familiar words. In fact, Mandela himself was just taken off the terrorist list about 4 years ago. He can now come to the United States without special exception. And within that framework, the Cold War on Terror, the U.S. continues towards South Africa. Well, at that point, two things happened, one of which is relevant to Israel-Palestine. But one thing that happened is that Cuba intervened again, as they had before. The Cuban intervention in Africa was a major factor in the liberation of the continent. What happened is, started in the 1970s, happened is that around 1990, the U.S. changed its policy, decided to get rid of apartheid. We don't have internal documents, so it's not certain what the reasons were, but you make a pretty good guess that the South African business community and the United States recognized that it would be more efficient to maintain the system, but without the official discrimination. So maintain the whole system of exploitation and domination and so on, but with a couple of black faces in the limousines. Very familiar. And that's pretty much what they decided on. And within a couple of years, apartheid collapsed, which is a great achievement. One shouldn't underestimate it. Although for most of the black population, it doesn't really mean a lot. In fact, they may be worse off than they were before, because the whole social and economic system has remained with a slight change in composition of the ruling class. But it's a significant change, no doubt. And it illustrates that you can struggle hard for something and gain an achievement, but it's a kind of plateau which just gives you a basis for going on to what really matters. Well, what's the significance of that for Israel-Palestine? That, I think, has a lot of significance. There's no Cuba in this case, but if the United States were to change its position, the U.S. has been blocking this unilaterally for 35 years. Britain and other countries kind of follow along behind the United States, but it's basically a U.S. initiative. And if the U.S. would change its policy, which I don't think is impossible, then I think the two-state solution could be instituted in some form. And as I said, that could lead on to other possibilities. So is there any possibility of that? Well, I mentioned before that on college campuses in the United States, Palestine solidarity is the biggest issue. Groups like this meet regularly. On Anti-Apartheid Week, every lot of universities had meetings like this. Very engaged, enthusiastic people. It's a radical change from just a few years ago. And I've been doing talks about these topics for probably 50 years. And until pretty recently, I was giving a talk on Israel-Palestine, and we really had to have police protection. Even in my own university, meetings were broken up, threats, death threats, and so on. But now it's totally changed. It's changed to the point where you can't get a hostile question, literally. It's a hostile question. It's from Palestinian activists who say you're not being strong enough. But, and that's an enormous change. And it's the kind of change that seeps into the society. In fact, according to, if you look at the recent polls on this topic, there's still, the polls indicate, overwhelming support for Israel, but if you look more closely, the support is among the elderly and the rich and Republicans. So the Republicans, the wealthy, the elderly, that are still very strongly supportive of Israel, but that's a diminishing group of people, at least the elderly. And probably Republicans, but so there's a basis for assuming that serious educational activist campaigns, if they're serious, could have an inroad and could lead to a change of policy which could be like South Africa. There's no great significance for the real power centers in the United States that there be the policy that I described rather than a two-state settlement. They could easily switch. And that could happen, which seems to me the most hopeful option that one could sketch for Palestinian rights at this point. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We all know about the horrors that Israel is inflicting and how the US is aiding, like you said.
I don't hear very well, so can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So like I said, we all know how horrible the situation is and how the governments are dealing with it. Is there anything you think that the people can do, the people that live in Israel? To get to one of the solutions that you outlined?
Like the kinds of tactics that were used in the case of South Africa. It happened. The international opposition to apartheid, which got to be enormous, didn't just happen by magic. It happened by a lot of engaged activism over decades. So it was educational work, discussions, organization. As I mentioned, by the late 70s, there was the beginning of what are now called BDS tactics. There was no BDS movement in the case of South Africa. There was just use of the tactics when they were appropriate. And I don't think there should be a BDS movement now either for the same reason. These are tactics. You use them when they work. It's not a kind of a principle to use them no matter what. And work means, like any tactics, you have to think through the consequences. So one effect of these tactics is delegitimization, impose the cost on the oppressor. So you could ask, well, what kind of tactics do that? But another part is a recognition that the point of the tactics is to educate the public, is to bring the public into to try to reach out to the public to get them to participate and to understand why. So tactics have to be carefully selected, as they were pretty much in the case of South Africa, so that they explain to people why they should participate and not alienate them because they go beyond their understanding. And that's true of tactics always. The nationalist movements have always understood this. So, I remember back in the days when we did any war movement in Vietnam, the Vietnamese were highly critical of a lot of the tactics that young people were using in the anti-war movement, because they recognized that those tactics will just alienate the population and increase support for the war, which is the last thing they wanted. They wanted to survive. So they often advocated the kind of tactics that, especially for young people, were considered laughable because they were so nonviolent and passive. I remember a discussion once where a group of Vietnamese, literally Vietnamese, were meeting with activists, suggested that they said what they really admired, they didn't want people to go down the streets breaking by windows and stuff. That's harmful. What they admired was a demonstration where a group of women went to the graves of American soldiers and just stood silently. They thought that was terrific, because that would bring to people some understanding of what's going on. They can go beyond that. That's what tactical decisions are like, no matter what you're dealing with. If you really want to achieve the goal, not just sort of feel good about it, you have to ask yourself what are the consequences. And that can be done. You can do it very effectively. And I think it's a lot easier now than it was in the recent past. Because for one thing, some of these tactics have been quite effective. And also because it's reaching out into the broader community. So the big human rights groups, like say Human Rights Watch, which are pretty conservative about these things, they don't like to get involved in these things, have finally forced the United States to shift policy. The most important, of course, is what happens there, but it's not isolated. It's about interaction among countries.
Professor Chomsky, what influence can online activism have?
Online activism? What kind do you mean? I mean, it can have an educational effect. That's the way you reach people.
So I was specifically referring to organisations such as the BAS, petition campaigns.
So what? Petitions? Sure. Petitions are part of activism. And there was apartheid attempts about anything. Petitions about human rights violations, about the occupations, the settlements, which are illegal, flatly illegal, agreed by virtually everyone. It was agreed by the United States up until the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration shifted the terminology crucially. Prior to Reagan, the settlements were called illegal, and the occupation was called an occupation, occupied territories. But in 1982, the Reagan administration shifted. The settlements became an obstacle to peace, but not illegal. And the occupied territories became disputed territories. Okay, well, that's obvious consequences. But aside from that, they're flatly illegal. And the evidence of every international body has determined that, Security Council, International Court of Justice, anyone can think of. So yeah, these things can go to human rights. Like, for example, what's going on in Jordan Valley that I mentioned. Well, that could be protested, but people have to know about it first. I don't think many people even know about it. And that's part of the task of activists to get people to know.
Last question, please.
Hi, thank you very much for this extremely informative talk. First of all, you mentioned that the Republican Party doesn't get as much money as the Democratic Party from the Jewish lobbyists in the US. Sheldon Adelson, who's one of the richest men on the planet, actively sponsors and gives money, millions of dollars to the Republican Party. So I think it would be wrong to say that the Republican Party isn't as well supported by Jewish lobbyists. That's just a detail. To come to Israeli, just to say that there is young Israelis who are actively promoting peace in Israel. There are youth groups such as Shomer Zair, who is based on socialist youth groups throughout the world, who actively help the communication, and I invite the Palestinian Society to get in touch with these youth groups in the UK. And finally, do you think that the Middle Eastern world should lead by example by eroding these imperialist borders, that Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon should open their borders to each other and perhaps to Gaza?
The first part about the Republican Party. Well, there's some Jewish scientists in the Republican Party. Adelson, for example, who's he's an individual. That's not a lobby. He's got plenty of money. She gets from casinos and
Richest man on the planet.
yeah, he's a very rich guy, $4 real. One shouldn't. Ethnic lobbies can make a difference. But typically, ethnic lobbies can have a swing effect. It's the real power in the country doesn't like it. So they can eliminate any ethnic lobby in 5 seconds. It's the business lobbies, let's say, decide they don't like what some ethnic lobbies do. They're totally overwhelmed. So it's real. What about opening the borders? Well, I was in, as I said, just as far as Republicans are concerned, but now that I think the Christian right is a much more powerful lobby than the Jewish lobby. The borders, it's serious. Egypt, particularly, that's Gaza's only outlet. Well, I was there in Gaza a couple months ago, and there's serious shortages. So, for example, right in the middle of the last Israeli bombing, the UN released its weekly report on the humanitarian crisis. And over half of the central medicines were lacking. It wouldn't take a lot to get that across the Egyptian border. Also construction materials and much more. But Egypt's not doing it. In fact, Egypt's closing down the border. You probably saw that they started an tactic last week, a couple weeks ago, pouring raw sewage into the tunnels to try to, it's worse than what Mubarak did, try to block them, but not with that. That's a problem. The Egyptians, I was in Egypt too, they just don't seem to be paying much attention to it. They've got other problems in their minds. But by all accounts, what's called the Palestinian dossier in all the Arab states is still in the hands of the Mukhabarat, the vicious secret police, which works closely with the Mossad and the CIA. And that appears to be true also in Egypt. So they have opened the border somewhat, but nowhere near enough. I'm not sure they should do it. But I suspect, talked to a lot of people in Egypt about this, that part of their reason for not opening it up is that they're aware that Israel would like to expel the population. And they don't want to have the Gaza population expelled in Egypt. Sinai, they have enough problems already, a lot of problems in fact. And maybe part of the reason. But in any event, they partially opened the border, but not totally. I didn't understand what you meant by that. Did you say Lebanon?
That you were talking about.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I just have a few thank yous. I'd like to thank Sam, the president of the society. He's actually the one that organized this talk, but he's going to be here today because it's got field workers as well. And I would like to thank Toby for organizing the posters and everything. And I would like to thank all the volunteers. If we can give them a round of applause for helping.